Hello everyone. So today we will discuss about how to prepare for CS fundamental interviews, or like the CS fundamental interviews for new grad interviews. So basically, we will not discuss about the things here. We will just talk about what to read and from where to read. So basically we will talk about three things: operating systems, networking, and DBMS. Like, what are the things you need to study, and what are the most important topics that you need to focus on for the new grad interviews that revolves around like CS fundamentals. So without getting means without wasting any time, so let's get started. So basically, just let me share my screen first of all. Yeah, so if you can see the doc. So basically, as I told, there will be three parts: operating system, networking, and database management, or DBMS. Okay, so out of these two things, generally networking is the most important thing. Okay, but the other two things, that is operating system and DBMS, are also quite important. So basically you will get most of the questions from networking, because it's easier to ask theory questions from networking. Okay, so generally CS fundamental interviews revolve around like theory questions. You don't have to write any kind of code or any implementation. Okay, so they generally like revolve around implementation. So generally the most of the questions come from networking, but yes, DBMS is also very important. You can be asked to write some SQL queries as well. Like, the interviewer might ask you to write some SQL queries. They can give a very simple query, and they can ask you to write the SQL code for it. Similarly, operating system is a relatively not much important topic, but like, you should prepare. You should not take the risk of going unprepared in operating system and lose your offer just due to not preparing operating system. Okay, so let us see what are the topics you need to focus on. So first of all, in operating system you need to focus on process scheduling algorithms. Like, what are the different process scheduling algorithms, what are the advantages and disadvantages of that, which of them are means which of them are useful in various conditions. Like, the interviewer can give you some conditions, like some, let's say, hypothetical situations. The interviewer will give you some hypothetical situations and ask you that which process scheduling algorithm will be the most optimal in this case. Okay, so you have to answer that with sufficient amount of reasons, that I am using this because this scheduling algorithm is optimal for this situation, and the disadvantage of this scheduling algorithm is this. So you have to make a complete answer, like stating the advantages and stating the disadvantages also, like why have you chosen this over other process scheduling algorithms. The next topic is deadlock prevention and recovery. So deadlock is a very important and a very famous topic in operating system. Like, what is deadlock, means why deadlock occurs, and how can you prevent deadlock. These are the three very important and very famous questions for interviews. Okay, so many of the times you will be asked these questions directly, that what is deadlock, how to prevent it, and why does it occur. So there are some conditions why deadlock occurs. There are four conditions. You can go and read about them. I will share the link in the doc, and the doc will be shared to you after the session. So basically there are four conditions why deadlock occurs. There are some ways to prevent them as well. And deadlock is basically when things when situation A depends on B, and situation B depends on A. So it's becomes a cycle, and you can't get out of the cycle. uh, the roadmap will be shared just after the session. Like, the crackDSA team will share the doc with you, so nothing to worry about. So just listen that what you need to study here and how should you go about these topics. I think that will be sufficient for the interviews. So next is IPC, or inter-process communication. So IPC is very important, and like, why IPC is used again, why is it used, and like how can you use IPC, like means on which situations should you use IPC, and so on. So basically these are very theory type of questions. So if you read about the questions, you can definitely answer about them. So one of the very useful resources of reading CS fundamentals is a scalar top interview questions. So personally, I would recommend that always read about the top interview questions from scalar before going into an interview. That will help you immensely. So next, also read about thread synchronization, multi-threading, and also read about the difference between multi-threading, multiprocessing, and multitasking. Okay, so read about all these three differences. So next, if we go to networking, so in networking, you first of all you should read about the OSI model, the number of layers in the OSI model, the role of each layer in the OSI model. That's very important. What is the role of each layer in OSI model? And the structure of the OSI model, that is how many layers are there, which layer appears in which level of the OSI model, and so on. Okay. So, secondly, you should read about the routing algorithms, the different ways you can route a network. Similarly, you should read the differences between the network devices like routers, switches, hubs, in which layer the means in which layer these devices lies. For example, routers lie in some different layer, switches lie in some different layer, and so on. So you should read the differences between these three. Like, it's a very again common and famous question: what is the difference between a router and a switch, or what is the difference between switch and a hub, and when should you use it? Okay. OS is generally, like, in interviews it's theoretical, so but in real life it's definitely you have to use it. For example, in my current internship I am using multi-threading. Okay, so in interviews they will not generally ask you to write multi-threaded code or use multi-threading in your code, but they will ask theoretical questions. Okay, so I think that answers your question, Satvik. So uh, similarly for other things also, like networking, DBMS, like in interviews theory will be asked, but in real life, like you implement these topics in your code, okay, to make it faster, efficient, and reliable. Okay, so transport, if I talk about the transport layer protocols, so another very famous question: what is the difference between TCP and UDP? Okay, so and when we should use it? Okay, so again read these differences, and these differences are very well compiled again in scalar interview questions. Okay, so so again, like, what is the full forms and what is the use of HTTP, FTP, and SMTP? Okay, like when uh, each of them are used, like for mailing, let's say the interview asks you, like, I want to mail a friend or a colleague, which application layer protocol I should use? Okay, so it should be SMTP. Okay, simple mail transfer protocol. So you should know, like, for which situations which protocols will be used. I think, Rohit, Linux is not important. What is important here is that you should know the fundamental theories. You should know things like how computers generally work. Okay, so, and I think these topics will be more than sufficient to help you with the new grad level interviews. If you are going for SD interviews, if you are going for SRE, like system reliability engineer, like, I think you should go more in depth. But for SDs, I think these are more than sufficient. Okay, so if I talk about the next, data management system, so first of all you should learn the difference between non-relational and relational database. Like, what is the disadvantage of using relational database and what is the disadvantage? Similarly, what is the advantage of non-relational database and what is the disadvantage? You should learn about SQL queries, like the various SQL syntax, to be very honest. Like when let's say the interview asks you that I want to select the names of the employees whose average salary is greater than 65,000. Okay, so you may need to write the SQL code for this. Okay, or the interviewer might ask you that I want to print the roll number of the students whose average marks is greater than 80%. Very simple questions. The interviewer might ask you to write the code, and it doesn't take more than 4 or 5 minutes to write the code, and that's why the interview may ask you to write the code after your DSA interviews are over. Okay, so be familiar with the SQL syntax. Okay, so one very good resource for reading SQL syntax is W3 Schools. So they have everything about SQL syntax, like the where, group by, and like everything about SQL, like you need to know as a beginner. So they have a very structured content for SQL syntax. Okay, so you can go and read about SQL from W3 Schools. So it will be very helpful for you. Next is indexing techniques. So the interviewer might give you some questions on DBMS and like ask you that how can I optimize this by indexing. And why I have mentioned indexing here is that because most of the times your query or your answer or your code can be optimized by indexing. Okay, like most of the questions revolve around indexing. Like most of the optimization questions in data management system revolves around indexing. Okay, so read about indexing, like how you can optimize your queries using indexing, where indexing is used, how indexing is used, and be prepared with all the indexing concepts and all the indexing techniques. Okay, next is ACID properties. This is another very important topic and probably the most important topic in database management system. Okay, so basically you means this means at least one question should come from ACID properties if you are giving a DBMS interview or a CS fundamental interview. Like in every interview having CS fundamentals, so I was asked at least one question from ACID properties. So ACID basically A stands, so you should know what the things stand for and like why you should follow ACID properties in like DBMS. Okay, also like read about some practical applications of ACID properties, like some uh, real life applications of databases where ACID properties are implemented. Okay, so for example, like means if let's say the interviewer asks you that person A is writing something and person B is writing something in the database at the same time. Okay, so what should you do in this case? Okay, so your answer should be like, means sorry, if the interviewer asks you that let's say a person wants to deposit some money into your bank account, so what property should you use in this case? So your answer should be A, or atomicity. Like either the money will be deposited or the money will not be deposited at all. Like either the whole amount will be transferred or nothing will be transferred. So the interviewer will ask you this kind of questions, that let's say a person A is performing this kind of operation on the database, which property you have to make sure that the database is following. So for example, in this case you have to answer that in so the database must be following atomicity. Okay, like either the full amount will be transferred or nothing will be transferred, nothing in between. Okay, so this is how ACID properties questions will be asked. Similarly, again for query optimization, again the thing like things go like this. Like the interviewers first will ask you to write a code in SQL most probably, and then he will tell you to optimize it. So first of all you should read about SQL syntax, because in SQL like there are a few ways of optimizing things. So if there are chances of optimization, most probably it will be there in the SQL syntax. So you should read SQL syntax very, means very clearly. You should understand the SQL syntax very clearly. When the interviewer asks you to optimize it, so you should be able to optimize it. Other than that, other things are also there like indexing and all. Okay, so apart from this, like you should also have a general knowledge of how like things work about computers, how means how networks work, how computers work in general. So basically this should be sufficient for CS fundamental interviews. Apart from this, like in CS fundamental interviews, I will tell you like how the flow goes. So for example, first of all it starts with your project in the resume. Okay, so let's say you have a web development project or you have a website in your project. So generally the interviewer opens the website, sees the code of the website. Like if you have the code, he will definitely see it, or most probably he will see it, and then he will go to some line of code which involves this kind of operations. Like if you have a backend project, so it will have database. Okay, so at some point you will be querying some database, or you will be querying some like any API or something. Okay, so then the interviewer will pick up that line, the line where you are querying the database, and he will ask you that you are querying the database in this line. So let's say instead of doing this thing, I want to do this thing in your project, so how would you write the code, or how would you modify this code? So like that you have to prepare, like go through each line of your code, see like where you are calling the database or where you are applying multi-threading. Like in some project there can be multi-threading also, like maybe like you have implemented multi-threading, so like the interviewer can pick up that line and tell that why are you applying multi-threading, why not other like single thread and all, like what are the advantages of using multi-threading, what are the drawbacks, and so on. So similarly, like for networks also the same, like when you are hosting a website, so that connects to a network, so at some point there will be a code piece of line of code that will be related to networking, so he will come to you and ask you about that code. Okay, so another thing that you have to keep in mind in CS fundamental interviews is that make sure you know each and every line of your project, like at least 80% to 90% of your project code, so that you when you are ask questions on your project, so you can relate those things to these CS fundamental topics. Okay, so that's very important. So I don't want to make this video very longer because these are the things you need to generally study. So if I have to summarize once again, so first of all, like read about process scheduling algorithms, like various algorithms are there like FCFS and also read about them, like what are the differences between them, disadvantages, advantages, what are deadlock, how to prevent it, and why does it occur. Read about IPC threading, and if I talk about network, read about OSI model. This is very very important. Read about routing algorithms, the advantage of each routing algorithm and the disadvantages, and also try to have some knowledge at when means the scenarios in which our routing algorithms should be used, like different routing algorithms will be used in different scenarios, right? So read about those. Similarly, you should know the differences between routers, switches, and hubs, like which layer they operate in, like what are the differences between them. Similarly, the application layer protocols, like in which case you use which protocol. Similarly, the difference between TCP and UDP. This is very important, and this is a very famous interview question. The difference between TCP and UDP. I have been asked at least 4 times this question, directly this question, that what is the difference between a TCP and UDP. Okay, so similarly, if I talk about database, like what is the difference between RDMS and like non-relational databases, know the SQL syntaxes very well, because most probably if you are having a DBMS interview, you will be asked to write some SQL code. Like at some point of time, the interviewer will give you a question and you have to code that in SQL. Okay. So also read about indexing, because indexing is a very famous topic and can be used for optimizations. Also read about ACID properties, just as I told that the interviewer will say that I want this operation to be done in this database. What ACID property will be used here and why? Okay, so similarly like this, and also read about the various optimizations you can do while querying a database. Like there can be various methods of optimization, like retrieving data from the database in faster ways. Okay, so this is basically the optimization, and there are several ways. Try to read about them, because after you have written an SQL code, the interviewer may ask you that can you suggest some ways of optimizing the query, or even if the question is theoretical and you give an answer, so the interviewer might ask you that, let's say the database contains only these kind of data, so based on this, can you optimize this query? Okay, so query optimization is also very important. Try to read about them. So I think that's all for this session, and I think this should be sufficient for any new grad interviews, even for coordination. Like they don't go beyond this, but these things you have to know very clearly, and you have to be very well prepared with these topics. Okay, so the links or the resources will be shared to you within this doc just after the session, so don't worry about that. So after the session, the crackDSA team will share you the doc. So if you guys have any questions, so I will be happy to take them. Otherwise, I think we can end this session. I think nobody has any question, so I think we can end this session and like try to prepare the questions. Uh, Again, means these questions for your interviews. So I think this will be more than enough, because these things are not much. Basically, you can start preparing from 1 week before the interviews, and I think means you will cover all the topics. Okay, so I also prepared for 1 week before the interviews, and I think means 1 week is more than enough for this kind of interviews, because in new grad you will be not asked very much in depth, you will be just asked theoretical questions to make sure that you know the concepts or not. Okay, so I think that's all for this session. See you tomorrow in the next session, where we will discuss about the system design basics and like how you should prepare for system design interviews for new grad level.